Morning. Sherry mentioned I was on the Australian Prime Minister's list of the top 100 leaders in Australia. I was number 99. I just slipped in at the end. It had all these Nobel Prize winners and unbelievable people on it, and then they sort of slipped me in at the end. Sort of last-minute addition. It's great to be here today. I worked at Facebook for a long time, and I'm obviously conscious of the role, unfortunately, that Facebook played here in recent events. Now, I left Facebook 2 years ago before things happened here. I'm going to reserve some time at the back end for a few questions, and if we want to discuss that space, I'm more than happy to. But what I'm here today to talk to you about is really what I focus on since I've left Facebook, and that's looking at things that are a lot more. Let me just get my clicker going. Oh, there we go. Looking at things that are a lot more about how we lead in the 21st century. This room is full of people who are involved in technology, right? So, I'm amongst, friends here. But the reality is we're working with businesses and with other people, with customers who don't necessarily understand technology the way we do. They didn't grow up with technology as something that a language they spoke from day one. They don't know necessarily how to build a business in this digital world. And they don't know how to build themselves in that world. I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, a lot of time in the startup land, and a lot of time at Facebook. But since I've left, I now spend most of my time actually with traditional companies, trying to help them make this transition. Here in Australia and New Zealand, we are very good at adopting new technology. It's amongst the best markets in the world for Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple. But the reality is businesses and government are further behind. Small business, big business, and government. We're starting to fall down the league table a bit in Australia and New Zealand. I'm trying to do my little effort to try to get us up that league table. Now, before I kick off, I just want to make reference to this slide up here. I was lucky enough when I left Facebook, I was invited to speak at TEDx in Sydney. Now, many of you might know TED Talks, and maybe you've been to TED Talks, and TEDs are all over the world. They're in almost every city in the world, but the biggest one in the world is in Sydney. It has 5,000 people in the convention center in Sydney, and I was invited to do it, and it sounded like a great idea. And then as I got closer to the date, it seemed like not such a good idea, because essentially it's a very bad distribution of risk, right? If you do a good TED Talk, you're just one of thousands of good TED Talks, and there's unbelievable TED Talks. If you do a bad TED Talk, guess what? It lives on the internet forever. So the KPI for doing a TED Talk is just don't screw it up, right? So as you get closer and closer, you're getting more and more nervous. And I got there on the day, and you're not allowed to stand on that stage until the moment you walk out onto it. So it's super intimidating. Now, on the day, I had this wonderful minder. She took me around. She made me comfortable. I was there for a couple hours. Eventually, they get you all mic'd up. They bring you to the back of these big curtains, and you're standing there waiting for the moment to be called out in front. And she puts her hand on your shoulder. And she says, when I take my hand off your shoulder, you go. And I was standing there, and then suddenly I was like, how long has that hand been off my shoulder? Shit. So I come running onto the stage. And so you saw me run on the stage here. Ever since then, I've kind of run onto the stage and bring the energy. Luckily, I didn't screw up my TED Talk. It went pretty well. And I've got like 1,000 views, so I urge you to go to YouTube and find it. The guy who went before me put this thing up his nose, and he does this weird voice thing. His name's Tom Thumb. He's very talented. He has like over 1 million views for his TED Talk before mine. I have about 1,000. So people like to see sort of strange stuff. They don't want to listen to me. Now, just to, I did work at Facebook for many years. My role was to help set up the Asia Pacific business for Facebook, and then to run the Australian New Zealand business. So I was involved from pretty early days in Facebook, kind of just before the IPO up until a couple of years ago. And I was really that sort of from the adolescent phase to the adult phase. I was one of the first adults brought into the room, as it were. And so my role was to really build a business on top of what was still back then a bit of a kind of a hot tub full of teenagers. And it was a really wild ride. I had a lot of fun. I learned a lot of things, and a lot of good things happened. And as we've seen, there's a lot of sort of bad things have happened as well. But I just want to say a couple things about Mark before I continue. And I don't want to talk about Mark all day, but there's two things. One is, when you first meet him, he's really short. Now, have you ever met somebody very famous or, eminent, and you think, wow, they're going to be really impressive? And you meet Mark, and he's not really that impressive. He's this little guy. He just comes walking in, and he doesn't really sort of grab you or say anything. And so you have to kind of lean down, crouch down to talk to Mark. The second thing about him is he's not perfect. He's full of flaws, as we all are, but he is a genius. And I am not a genius. I know other geniuses in Silicon Valley. I know a few people who are super smart who know Mark as well, and they say, yeah, he is a genius. He's at the meetings on Wednesday night. They always see him there. the Genius Club. But imagine that. Imagine if your boss is a genius. Now, if your boss is here with you today and sitting next to you, they are a genius, of course. So make sure you tell them that. But imagine if your boss is a genius. Every time you go see your boss, you're trying to impress them, right? And you're on slide 1, and they're on slide 72 of your PowerPoint pack, where they've blown right through it. They don't even need to see your slide. They haven't even read your slides. They've thought about everything. It's just so frustrating because it's a hard person to impress. But luckily, I had a pretty good run at Facebook, and we were very proud of the business that we built in Australia and New Zealand. We were probably, these two markets are amongst the most successful in the world for Facebook, as I mentioned, but Google and Apple and others as well. But for Facebook, it was a very successful market for us. But now I'm out of Facebook, and I spend my time on stages like this, with leadership teams, with boards of directors in Australia and New Zealand, really helping them come to grips with this whole digital disruption. How do we move forward into this new world where none of us, many of us, were never trained for this, right? Leaders today weren't trained how to use data. They weren't trained how to think about technology first. They weren't trained about being obsessed about customers. But these are the things that we need to change in ourselves as leaders to be successful. Just one small shout out here. I'm also chairman of a big conference in Sydney called CeBIT. It's the biggest technology and business conference in the Asia Pacific. It happens at the end of October. I would love to see you there. If you do come and you see me wandering around, please jump up and say hi. It's about 15,000 people turn up in Sydney at the convention center. And I've got a little promotional code here for anybody who wants to go. Just type that in and you get a little discount on your pass. So I'd love to see you there. Okay, let me get into this a little bit. What is digital? We kind of all hear this word. I just want to level set on what it is, how we define it in Silicon Valley. We'd say it's the application of three things: data, technology, and analytics. And analytics, the higher form of analytics is artificial intelligence, right? Just like smart analytics. But it's applying those things to four different areas. And it's important for all of us to be on the same page. One is the products and services that we make. So when you say digital to a general business person, they often think it's the website you have or the mobile app you have. Well, that's part of it, but it's not all of it, right? There's four other things. There's the assets inside of our business. There's also the processes and operations about how things move around and things get done. And then finally, there's the workforce. It's making sure we digitize people and give them the tools they need to work with each other and to work with machines in a way that makes them the most effective and most impactful that they can be. And it's important to think about all four of these areas because most of the disruptive companies in the world, they're disruptive across the combination of all four of these. And if you want to disrupt, you've got to think about all four of them as well. And so the second question is, what is disruptive, right? We hear this a lot. I'll give you my my definition of it. It's just very effing fast and effing powerful. Like you feel it coming. It's that jump to hyperspeed. We see it in industry after industry now. A competitor that a few years ago was not even taken seriously is suddenly the disruptor in that space. We see it in industry after industry. Media, it has happened. Retail has happened. Financial services is now happening. And so the speed with which this moves sometimes means you need to look for a faint signal in the data. You don't wait for the case study. You need to just find a faint signal in data and say that signal is going to overwhelm us unless we move faster. Let me tell you a few stories then about this kind of overwhelmingness that's been happening in the past few years. Now, this happened a couple of years ago in Australia. Now, I had a very frenemy relationship with the traditional media. We partner with them, but we also were competing with them. Now, in Channel 10 in Australia, there's 3 commercial TV networks, and Channel 10 in 2017 went bankrupt. It went bust. Okay, and those 4 people at the bottom, who are 4 very prominent and wealthy Australian billionaires, back in 2012, they put about $1 billion of their own money into Channel 10 because they thought free-to-air TV was a really good bet. In 2012, they thought that was a good place to put $1 billion. By 2017, when Channel 10 went bankrupt, they lost all that money. It was gone. Now, Channel 10 lives on. It was bought by CBS, an American broadcaster, so it lives on. And it's full of smart people, and it creates some great programming. But it struggled to survive in this disruptive world. Now, around the time that this was going on, I was leaving Facebook, and I got a phone call from another media billionaire who I did not know, but I knew his son. And he invited me over to have lunch. So we sat down and had a very candid conversation. Over about 3 hours, we had lunch. And there's a couple things he said that I really wanted to share with you. At one point, I was showing him something on my... at one point, I said to him, if I came to you just like 3 years ago, and I said, who are your top 10 competitors? Where would Facebook have been on your list, right? Were we way up the top? We were down the list. And he said, you wouldn't have been in my top 100 3 years ago. He said, if I pulled out my 5-year plan from 3 years ago, Facebook, Google, Netflix, you guys aren't even mentioned in my 5-year strategy from 3 years ago. But as we were having that lunch, Facebook, Google, Netflix were probably his biggest problems. They were the biggest things he was dealing with a lot of things, but they were the biggest things he was dealing with. So we went from not even being in his 5-year plan to being his biggest problems in just 3 years. That really struck me. And then the second thing happened was I showed him something on my phone. I was showing something on Facebook, like a post or something, and he leans over to me and he goes, this is the first time I've ever looked at Facebook on a mobile phone. And I was like, you are shitting me, man. You gotta be kidding me. I was really surprised because, wait a minute, you've got $1 billion tied up in competing with the likes of Facebook, and 2 billion people on Earth have managed to get Facebook onto their phone, right? It's not that hard, but you haven't bothered to do it. Like, what's going on? And he said to me, I've kind of lost my curiosity. He started to become reflective. He said, in the early days, I used to get close to everything. I was out in the streets myself. I was, they have a big they had an out-of-home advertising business. They go and he'd inspect every single billboard himself. And he said, now I got all these people doing it. I got these digital folks. I got 98% of my business is over here. 2% over there is the digital thing. And I know I never get any time. I don't even have 2% of my time for the 2%. And so he'd lost his curiosity, he lost being close to his customers. There's no way he's going to compete with Facebook and Netflix if he doesn't get Facebook on his phone, right? You've got to have that curiosity and that drive. And so this is what happened in those 5 years between when those billionaires put their $1 billion into Channel 10 in 2012 and 2017. Now, back in 2012, Facebook was about a 900 million user platform, right? It's pretty big, almost 1 billion users. But this is what happened in those 5 years. Facebook grew to over 2 billion. Messenger was spun out, grew to over 1 billion. WhatsApp was bought and grew to over 1 billion. And then Instagram was bought and grew to 700 million. That's recently crossed 1 billion itself. So on this one metric alone, in just 5 years, we went from what was already a 1 billion user platform to 5 billion users. Some of them the same users, but a 5x increase. And this media baron, billionaire, didn't even have Facebook on his phone during that period of time. I lost a lot of sympathy for him at that moment. There's just no excuse not to be close to the product. Okay, here's a second story from the world of retail. I was with the board of a big Australia, New Zealand retail giant recently, and this board of directors was grappling with Amazon, right? They were asking me all these questions about Amazon. My wife actually works for Amazon, an unbelievable company. I've got good friends there. And they were asking all these questions, what should we do about Amazon? Now, instead of me telling them, I started asking them some questions. I just wanted to sort of probe things. So this is one of the questions I asked them. I said, how many people do you have working on artificial intelligence to support voice today, right? Because as we all know, Amazon, Google, there's a huge competition now to get voice assistants into your homes, right? In Australian homes, the US homes, there's this big battle on voice. So I was really curious. You're competing with Amazon, so how are you going in voice? It's a big Australian retailer, 30% market share, and their answer was pretty disappointing. Nobody. Zero. They had not one person working on artificial intelligence to support voice. Over at Amazon, they've got over 2,000 people working on artificial intelligence in their Alexa division. They've got thousands others working to support AI in their cloud business, in their marketplace business. I heard recently there's more job openings in the Echo and Alexa division of Amazon than there are job openings in all of Google. Now, what does that tell you? It says, well, Amazon's made this decision to put a big bet into voice. So I asked a couple of questions of this board of directors. The first was, you decided to do nothing. Can you tell me why? Take me through your logic and take me through the conversation on the day you decided that you were going to do nothing, that this wasn't an important problem to solve. And what do you think their answer was? No answer. It was a non-decision. We never discussed it. That's bad, right? You should never have a non-decision from a board about something that's strategically important. And the second question was, well, why has Amazon decided to invest billions of dollars and spend years and hire thousands of people to do this? Why are they doing it? And this board struggled with the answer. These were smart people, but they just didn't kind of get it. And so I said, look, it's simple. It's a technology thing. It's a digital native thing. It's called friction, right? It's about removing friction from a consumer experience. Amazon knows as long as you're typing into your phone with your thumbs, there's only so big e-commerce is going to get. And they're an e-commerce player. There's only so big that they can become. There's only so much market share they're going to grab. So they need to go past that frontier of friction of typing to computers, and the next frontier is talking to computers. So that's why they've been focusing on it. And then what's the next frontier after talking to computers? It's reading your thoughts, right? The human-machine interface. Amazon, Facebook, Google, all these guys have hired some of the best human-machine interface people in the world, and they are now trying to solve that problem. Now, they may never get there. It may not be possible. It might be decades away, but they're trying to. Why? Because they're thinking about friction and how do I break this down. And this is not something that this retailer thinks about. It's not how they think about the world in terms of friction. So it's a very big change in terms of their mindset about how they compete. And this is a big problem that many retailers have. There's some great retailers that will survive because they're smart, they're well-run, and they're making the right moves, but there's a lot of retailers that they're too late to the party and they're not going to survive as we go forward. And here's another story. I was with this airline recently, Qantas. I love Qantas. I love Air New Zealand. I love Virgin. I'm very agnostic about every plane I fly on. These are terrific airlines. Now, this is Alan Joyce, their CEO. I was with him and his leadership team. And he was asking me, if Facebook or Google or Amazon was running an airline, what would you do differently? This is a great question because I have no idea how hard it is to run an airline, right? You got to keep planes in the air, got to keep them from crashing. It's really tough. So I tried to be useful. I asked questions again. So I said, I focused on this question of friction, and I said, well, how much do you know about how well people sleep on your planes? Because I would imagine that's the biggest friction in long-haul travel, right? For customers, for all of us. And how many of you look forward to jumping on a plane and flying to Singapore or to London or LA? You dread it. It's the sleep. Sleep is the worst thing. So they said to me, look, we do surveys of our customers, so we have a little data. And then they went into solution mode, and they started telling me how they try to not pour too much alcohol. They train people you can't get too drunk. They take the spiciness out of the food because that can do it as well. And then they told me about the flatbeds in business class and how comfortable they were. They told me how great they were and how well designed. And I said, look, with all due respect, that is not how most people sleep on your planes. It's horrible. It's the worst possible experience. So what you're telling me is you're a customer-centric business. Most airlines in the world are customer-centric, right? It's like apple pie. And you're very good at it. But you're not customer-obsessed. Because a customer-obsessed business, like a digital native company, would say, no, we're not going to stop at not knowing the answer to that question. What are we going to do? Well, they're going to do something like get sensors that they can embed in the cabin of the plane that are so sensitive they can measure the dew point and the condensation and the CO2 and the air pressure. And a sensor that's so good that it can measure, that one embedded here can measure how well you're sleeping right over there. And if those sensors don't exist, what would these companies do? They would invent it, right? They would invent the technology. Amazon invented the cloud to store its own data. Now, AWS is its biggest business. Facebook builds its own servers to put in its data centers because the ones from Cisco aren't good enough. I recently spoke at a Cisco event, and they said, no, we've improved our servers, and they're back in Facebook. So I'm like, that's great. Facebook doesn't worry about that anymore. So these companies, they build technology to solve these customer problems, right, because they're too important to solve. Now, to their credit, the CEO, he ran out of the room, he said, you're absolutely right, we got to solve this. So they've gone off, they're trying to work out the state of the sensing markets and what they can patent and what they can acquire. They're working with Boeing and Airbus to try to embed sensors into the cabins of the plane. They're now starting to say to themselves, actually, maybe we can not just be the world's safest airline, which is what Qantas' reputation is, maybe we could be the world's best sleeping airline. And to me, that's even more important than being safe, because I want at least a good night's sleep before the plane hits the ground. I need to make sure I'm well rested. And then they're going a step further. They're saying, most airlines don't make any money. They're notoriously unprofitable. But you know what? We have more people sleeping in a controlled environment than any other kind of business in the world. There's a whole other business in the world called sleep science, which needs tons of data. And so they've started to think through, actually, maybe we could make more money from sleep science data than we could make from running an airline itself. They're starting to reimagine the type of business they might even be in. So this is a great example of being customer-centric is great, but are they truly obsessed by particularly these big points of friction? And then finally this. Imagine there's a business that has this characteristic. It has unbelievable data. And it's got data on a huge swath of households, businesses, across the whole economy. This is the kind of data that a Facebook or Google or an Amazon would just dream of having. Now, I ask you a question. If you had this kind of data, you own this company, and you were the CEO, how many things would you choose to sell to these customers that you had this unbelievable data set on? Now, if I go over to these guys, a bank, what's their answer to that question? One thing, money. I spoke at a banking conference recently, and somebody said, no, it's financial services. I said, fair enough, I just call it money. It's money in a few different forms. And banks are very good at this. They've done it for 100 years, 200 years, right? But I go over to something like this, and what's his answer to that question? Everything. Why would I stop at one thing? Now, if you go to China, we're already in that space, right? The biggest financial services companies in China are not banks and financial institutions, they're tech companies. And today, we know that, Apple has a credit card, Amazon loans money to its suppliers, Google's moving into financial services. Everybody's thinking about it. Facebook's come up with a cryptocurrency. So suddenly, the walls that banks used to think were around their industries are starting to break down. It's not just fintechs, it's also big tech that are moving into that space. And what's worse is this, is banks' customers are starting to agree that say, hey, you spent 200 years branding money. This is a question from a recent survey in the US. The same would be true here as well. 55% of people said no problem. Over half of banks' customers say, I don't care that you branded money for 200 years. I will happily take a credit card from Apple. I'll get a home loan from my search engine, right? That's a big problem. And then the younger you get with their customers, the higher that percentage goes because they don't have this sort of loyalty. I read a piece of data lately that said it's like 80% of millennials have never set foot in a bank branch. Never set foot in a bank branch, right? Never even walked into one. Imagine that challenge that any bank is facing today. So what does this mean? It means that the game of business has changed. I think it has changed just in the past few years. We've hit this tipping point. Just in the past 3 or 4 years. And I would characterize it by saying there's a number of things that digital is disrupting. There's big things that are changing around how we understand how business is done. And these are the 5. And I'm going to go through each of the 5 just in turn to give you a little flavor. So the first is speed. The speed with which things are changing and the speed with which we need to move as leaders. Now, this is a great sort of example of speed. Now, this is how many years it took to get to 50 million devices, 50 million users of each of these devices or technologies. Now, for those of you a little younger in the audience, on the left side is a radio and a TV. And on the right side is Facebook and WeChat. I sit somewhere in the middle. Now, how many years did it get to 50 million TV users? 40 years. It took 14 years to get to 40 years to 50 million radio, 14 years to 50 million TV, 4 years to 50 million Facebook, and 4 months to 50 million WeChat users. Now, it's nice it's all 4, so it's kind of cool. But what's the implication? Think about the implications. What if your job back in the day was marketing, right? Like marketing's a big thing in media, right? Okay, when you walked in the door back in the age of Mad Men and the 1950s and 60s, when TV and radio were in their heyday, what happened? You walked in the door at 21 and they handed you a playbook and it said, okay, here kid, here's how we win in TV and radio. You carry that playbook through your whole career, you get to about 55, you're going to retire, you take that playbook and you hand it to the next kid. Kid, this is how we win in TV and radio. Nothing had changed. The playbook was essentially the same through your whole career. But now, if you're in marketing and advertising and you get to 50 million WeChat users in 4 months, guess what? What you learned in university, a lot of it's irrelevant. What you learned last month is irrelevant. What you wrote in your plan in the beginning of the year can become irrelevant just a few months into the year. That's how quickly things change. So think about how we have to change ourselves in terms of learning, adapting, and being curious in order to move fast to keep up this world. The second thing that's changing is the boundaries that sit around our industries. A few years ago, we all kind of thought we knew who our competitors were, right? If you were a supermarket, there was your competitor across the street. If you're a bank, oh, that's your competitor over there. If you're, your electricity company, oh yeah, there's the other electricity company. Everybody knew who they were competing with. Now that's all being blown up. Now this is a question that was asked a few years ago, and I'm going to give you the answer in just a minute. But I just want to ask this audience question. So, how many of you guys are Netflix subscribers today? Okay. Who's not a Netflix subscriber? Okay. What? It's not cheap enough for you? You need it. The Crown wasn't good enough. Stranger Things wasn't scary enough for you. It's pretty amazing, right? Netflix. Who'd heard of Netflix a few years ago? We didn't even know who they were. A lot of audiences around the world, I get to talk now and ask that question. It's like 95% of the hands go up, right? And a Netflix was nothing a few years ago. Now think about the poor, free-to-air television. Think about pay TV. Think about newspapers. Every moment of your eyeball that's spent on Netflix is not looking at that other media. It's not looking at Facebook. So there's this huge competition for your eyeballs, and Netflix has suddenly come in with this huge offer that's now sucking all this attention out of the economy. But this was a question that was asked of this guy back in 2010, and he didn't think that this was a problem. He was the former CEO of Time Warner, one of the biggest and oldest media companies in the world. Last year, they merged with AT&T. There's all this bulking up going on in media and tech right now. And when he was asked this question just 9 years ago, he was totally dismissive. He said, these guys are a mosquito, right? I couldn't care less about Netflix. Because up until 2010, Netflix's business model was to send you a DVD in the mail. That was what they did. They were a mail order business. I've worked in mail order businesses. They're not high tech, right? It's just shove something in an envelope, get it out the door. That's what they did. And then they decided, no, actually, this mail order thing's going to go away, and we're going to get into something else called streaming, right? They could see that the internet speeds were going up and the price of internet was going down and devices were proliferating. They said, this is going to be the new way people are going to consume content, and we got to get into it. As soon as they announced that to the market, guess what? Their share price tanked by 80%. Why? Because the market said, we like the DVD thing. Stick with that business model. Forget about this streaming thing. And Jeffrey Bukes kind of agreed. Streaming, what's that? That's not going to disrupt my space. These guys don't even compete with me. Well, what happened in the interim, right? The market capitalization is one measure. Time Warner, back in 2010, up into 2018, their market cap, they were a $24 billion business. They were about $75 billion when they were acquired by AT&T. That's pretty big, right? Well, over these guys, these little tiny guys, what happened? 50x, right? So the business that he thought wasn't even in his space is suddenly now, over twice his size. That's how quickly his world had changed and the boundaries were breached around his business. The third thing that's changing is the fuel that runs our business. You guys will be well familiar with this. This is not news, but I just want to give you a little perspective on it. It's data, right? Data is the new oil. It's the new opals. I use opals as an example because I need something from Australia and New Zealand. But I think it's actually true. If you go to the opal fields of Lightning Ridge or Cooper Pedy in Australia, what do you see? You see a lot of holes dug, right? And if you look in the holes, there's some interesting people in those holes, many from Albania, strangely enough. I met an Albanian miner, actually, in one of those holes, but years ago. But why is that? Because it's very non-predictive to look for an opal. You just kind of generally know where it is, and you have to start digging down. Well, data's kind of the same way now. The best companies in the world now are just collecting a lot of data, not just customer data, but all kinds of data, and then they're taking smart people and artificial intelligence and letting it dig down and look for insights. And sometimes I don't find those insights for years. But if you don't have the data, you're never going to be able to get there. You're going to discover years later, oh, we should have been collecting that data, but we didn't do it. This is a stunning fact. 90% of the data in all of human history has been generated just in the past 2 years. Think about that for a minute. I actually looked this up the other day. There's been 107 billion people who've ever been born on the face of the earth. 107 billion. 7 billion alive today. 3 billion don't have access to the internet. So about 4 billion of us have generated all the data in all of history in just the last 2 years. And what if you walked into a meeting, a board meeting or a management meeting, and somebody presented a slide that looks like this? It went flat for hundreds and hundreds of years, something really important for competition in your business, in your industry. And then suddenly, last 2 years, it just skyrocketed, right? It went crazy. What would you say if you were presented with that graph? You'd ask two questions. You'd say, what's the threat of this to our business? And then the second question would be, what's the opportunity if we get on top of it? But no, most boards of directors, most management teams have not been presented with this graph. If you're working with a company that doesn't understand that we are in a data tsunami now, I urge you to put together some sort of graph like that and get that in the front of the face of the leaders to say, this is a data tsunami. We have to change how we think about how we run our business. The reality is this: most of the future value we're going to create for customers lies in data that we don't collect or we don't understand today. We're all going to like a gunfight and we don't even have a knife. We're all going to a place where we're going to have to do battle in a business battle, and we haven't been trained in it, and we don't even have the tools that we need. So many companies today are going to be behind if they don't get on top of this data revolution. Culture needs to change as well. That's changing through the digital revolution. I only have one slide on this. There was many of you in the room will obviously be familiar with agile development. Well, there was an agile movement in Silicon Valley. They wrote a manifesto about 20 years ago, and this is one page of that manifesto. Now, agile's now moved out of software development. It's moving into broader corporate context. But I think this slide is really good at capturing the difference between the 19th and the 21st century, right? This kind of captures the difference, the different kind of organization we need to build. There's a couple acronyms there, MVP you'll all know, but ABM stands for Always Be Making. It's a Facebook thing inside of Facebook culture. which meant that you need to always be building something. And it was a counterbalance to having too much data and being too analytical, right? Facebook was very aware that if you want to continually try to analyze things, you could be paralyzed by always trying to get more data. So let's always build. Let's build products every single day. And then the fifth thing that's changing is the talent we need to bring into our businesses. A few years ago, this guy, he was unemployable, right? He lost his job at the Swiss Patent Office. Thank God for universities. They took him in and gave him a place where he could do his best work. But today, increasingly, this is the kind of person we need to bring into our companies, right? Our retailers, our media companies, our banks, right? But often they don't want to work for those companies, right? Because they're driven by different things. Now, one of the things that they might be driven by or not be driven by is career ladders, right? So most companies, how do you advance through a company, right? You come in and you manage nobody, then you manage 5 people, then you manage 10 people, manage 20 people. Essentially, it's more people you manage, the more successful you are. But what if Einstein doesn't want to manage anybody? And there's only a ladder for them to climb up. Well, guess what? They're going to get disenchanted and go somewhere else. So many Silicon Valley companies think about it in a different way. They think about a jungle gym. So people move around an organization. It doesn't matter how many people that you manage. It's actually the impact that you drive is what matters. Google, Facebook, Amazon, they all think hard about this problem. At Facebook and Google, we've got a manager path that you can go through in your career where you manage more people. And then there's something called an IC path, or individual contributor. And an IC can come in and they can advance at the same rate as somebody who's managing 50, 100, 1,000 people. They'll get the same promotion, same recognition, et cetera, and they'll never manage anybody. Some of the most impactful people at a lot of these big tech companies you'll find are essentially ICs. They've never managed anybody because that's not what they want to do, but they're so important to the organization. And then the final thing about talent is this, it's youth, right? We shouldn't lose focus on the fact that young people can change the world. I mentioned Einstein before. The best mathematicians in history all did their best work before they were 25 years old. Every single one. Once you get to 25, you get married, you get kids, and then you can't think anymore, right? You kind of lose your ability to focus. There's something about the young brain that is more malleable and is more impactful, particularly in more mathematical, scientific, computational, and even creative fields. Now, businesses like Facebook, Google, Amazon have started to realize this, and so they do things like they write their job descriptions and their job ads differently. Most job ads, the first 2 bullet points are, must have this degree and must have 5+ years experience doing X, right? Well, we kind of rip that out of our job ads for certain kinds of roles because we wanted to open the aperture to attract any kind of talent. We just want talented people to come in the door, and then we'll try to find the best opportunity for you to express that talent. We don't want you to self-select saying, oh, no, I've only done that job for 3 years. I haven't done it for 5. I'm not going to apply. That's the last thing that we want to hear. And so what does all this mean, right? All this change that's going on, these 5 things that are impacting because of digital. What does this mean for all of us who are in companies and trying to build businesses and dealing with legacy leadership that we need to transform? Well, what we learned in Silicon Valley and what I learned personally is that what's got us to the bottom of the mountain is not going to get us to the top. Unfortunately, I think this is Mount Everest, not Mount Cook, so my apologies. But it's not going to get us to the top. The 19th century bottom of the mountain, we're not going to get to the top of the 21st century. We need to build leaders in a different way. And so what I've realized through my time at Facebook and Silicon Valley is that there's 8 elements of leadership that really matter that we need to build into our leaders. And these are the 8. It's things like humility and curiosity, like I talked about before. It's things like data dexterity, being able to be as dexterous with data as you are with other things in your business. It's being obsessed by customers, not just customer-centric. It's moving fast and making sure you have time for the slow thinking. You make time to think fast and also think slow. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to give you a flavor for a few, just to give you a sense. So one is speed, moving faster. We talked a bit about that a minute ago. This is how we defined it in Silicon Valley. We said, look, it's this ability to move faster than seemingly required. Now, what do I mean by that? If you've ever dealt with somebody who's like an elite athlete, for whom speed is what matters, what will they tell you? They'll tell you that their personal best is never good enough. It's always frustrating. I sat next to Usain Bolt once at an event, and I asked him this question. I said, Usain, how do you feel about your PB? And he was like, oh, man, my PB, it drives me crazy. I can't sleep at night. And I was like, but your PB is like world record. You're the fastest man who's ever lived, 9.55. Doesn't that give you satisfaction? He says, no. He said, I am so driven by I need to lower that number. And so this is the kind of thing that a lot of Silicon Valley companies, tech businesses, try to inject into the culture. I'm sure a lot of your businesses here try to do the same thing. And so we think about time as like a fixed resource, but speed is this learned skill. You need to learn to be fast. You need to learn to actually do the things that need to go fast and then slow down for the things that need to be slow. There's a couple of big time sinks in every organization, things like meetings. A lot of people ask me, how were you successful at Facebook? And they think it's all going to be like big, big strategy, big tech stuff. And a lot of it was around, I rethought how I did meetings. We have a lot of problems. There's two big time sinks, meetings and communication, particularly email and other kind of messaging, right? They waste a lot of time. So we rethought everything we did at meetings at Facebook when I was there. So for example, I had our team in Australia. We hacked Microsoft Outlook, which the default is like a 1 hour or a 30-minute meeting. I made it 5 minutes. The default was 5 minutes. You said it means a 5-minute meeting. A lot of people are lazy. A lot of 5-minute meetings inside of Facebook because of that default. I did other things. We started to learn that actually there's only 4 reasons to have a meeting. You're going to tell, you're going to ask, you're going to decide, or you're going to brainstorm. And so we started to work through, I did it myself, I started to say, well, I need to think through why I'm having a meeting. Is it a mix of all these things? And I could break it into its constituent parts. Do I have the wrong people in the meeting to do the task at hand? Could I do it in another way, not a meeting? You have a lot of power when you set up a meeting. You just invite people, particularly if you're their boss, and then they have to come. And guess what? You can waste all those people's time in a meeting that they don't have to be at. God's not making any more time. Give them back time. If you're leading in a business, one of your key things you can do for your people is just give them back time. Re-engineer meetings. We do a lot of other stuff around speed as well. A great Amazon idea that Facebook picked up was 2 pizza teams. No team should ever be so big it cannot be fed with just 2 pizzas. So a team should only be 5, 6, 7, 8 people. That's maximum size. We had super small teams in Facebook. Amazon, my wife comes home. She used to work at Apple. Apple seems to have bigger teams. She had 20 people in her team there. At Amazon, she's got 1.5 people. She's got to do the exact same thing. And what does she do? She just focuses on what's most impactful and gets rid of all the other stuff. You don't make that 20-slide PowerPoint pack. You just think it through, do a few bullet points, and then move on. And then there's all these other things that we do in these cultures, and many of you will do the same. These are about injecting speed into the culture, keeping things moving fast, making sure we're hustling. Because if we're not solving this problem, somebody else in another part of the world probably is. Second thing, data dexterity. What do I mean by this? Many people in this room, you're going to be very, very good at data, but a lot of people aren't. I didn't grow up learning how to use data. I had a liberal arts background. I had to learn how to become dexterous in data. And so we define this as being the ability to apply data and analytics to every decision you make. Most managers and leaders in businesses, why are they there? They're there to make decisions, right? They're there to make decisions. And there's a few different types of decisions they make. You can actually analyze it. And you can work out, okay, how do we use data better to help enable those decisions? Intuition, gut feel, experience still matter, but guess what? Data is starting to win a lot more of these arguments. But many companies don't have this culture built into them yet. So data dexterous leaders need to learn to do a few things. They need to master fundamental questions. What are being able to have a conversation with the experts about how do I use this new toolkit? How do I use AI? What is machine learning good for? How do I use these different tools that I've heard about? They need to also have the conversations about how are we going to solve for the generating this data? We don't have it, so where are we going to get it? How do we get our hands on it? In a privacy-safe way, obviously. And then how are we going to develop the skills to analyze it, right? Are we going to hire 100 people to come into our business? Are we going to partner with an Amazon or a Google or somebody else to do it? Are we going to retrain some of our people who might be able to be our data analysts? And then finally, we need to change the processes inside to make sure that data is at the fingertips of leaders when they need to make the decision, right? Help them move faster and make more insightful decisions. Even when I joined Facebook, I can tell you, our data systems were shit. They were awful. I was responsible for a huge P&L in Asia Pacific about ad sales, right? It's built into a multi-billion-dollar business. And I had no idea where my sales were at any point in the month when I joined Facebook. We didn't have the systems to report it. So you had a sales target, and then you had no idea whether you're going to hit it until about 3 weeks after the quarter ended and you got a number. Oh, I did pretty well. That is not the way to run a business. So even Facebook had to build all these systems as well. It's not just they weren't born with having these systems right out of the crib. And then finally, there's customer obsession. This is that combination of data insights and obsession and paranoia, right? Data is very scientific, but it's important to keep the emotional in there too. Be obsessed, be paranoid. If you're not solving the problem, somebody else in the world is. Somebody in Israel or Australia or China or the US. Who knows? They're trying to focus on the same problem you are, or they're focused on the same customer you are, and they're trying to solve that problem better than you. Two things that Silicon Valley companies, digital native companies focus on. We talked about friction before, but there's also curation. So many companies sit on a ton of data that they do not use to present value to a customer at a key point in their journey. And this is what Amazon does. When you go to search something, Amazon says, and Trade Me as well. If it's people who bought this also like that. That's curation. Google curates the internet better than anybody else to give you the best results. And Facebook curates everything in the world of your friends and family to give you the best thing in your newsfeed every time you open it up. But I think there's something else going on here as well around customers, which is we're getting a redefinition of trust, privacy, and identity. And this is the big tsunami that's come up just in the past 2 years. When I was at Facebook, let's say 5, 6, 7 years ago, if I got up here and I started to talk about data identity and privacy and trust, people wouldn't have cared. Now everybody cares, and I think that's a really good thing. And there's a bunch of drivers of this that are going on. The one is that the erosion of trust, of faith in institutions, well before the internet, has been going on, unfortunately, for years, in government, in the press, in the church, all these institutions we used to have for decades. Trust measures have gone down precipitously. The second is the social structures that we used to know for a long time in our society have started to melt, right? We all move around a lot more. We don't grow up in the same street where our parents and our aunts and uncles and grandparents live. We live in different parts of the world, and so the social structures we used to know for hundreds of years have all melted away. We've got this aggregation of what I call nano bits of data, these tiny little bits. Everybody, your data is actually not worth that much, just me knowing one or two things about you. But if I can aggregate that against all kinds of other data, and then I can do that against millions of people, the total is worth a lot, right? And so now that aggregation's happening. It wasn't even possible a few years ago. We didn't have the computing power, we didn't have the cloud, but now we do. And so this is the problem that we're running into right now. None of us know the answer to this question. I don't know the answer. I work for Facebook. I have no idea what Facebook really knows about me. I have no idea what any company knows about me, and I have no idea what they're doing about it. That's bad. And so in the next few years, we're going to start sorting this out as a culture and as communities, because we all need to know, what do other people know about me and what are they using it for? And then the fourth thing, the first large-scale interfaces of AI-driven and analog-driven platforms. So we are in an age now where all of us are analog, right? We're all analog. It's the old-fashioned brain. But we're getting AI-driven systems that are now interfacing with us and the institutions that we built. So we're starting to see this. We've seen this now in entertainment. We're seeing it in retail. We're seeing it in advertising. We're seeing it in branding. We're seeing it in the human genome now. It's now being, AI systems are now mapping the genome. We're seeing how opinions get formed. How do I decide what's important when I go to vote? Well, that's now changing because of AI-driven systems like the internet and Facebook are creating all these filter bubbles for everybody, right? So that's happening as well. And then we've even got problems, as we know, with public safety. We've got AI-driven systems that are now interfacing with the world of public safety around things like depression, around self-harm, around teenage suicide, around some of the things that happened here in Christchurch. These are problems that we all together need to come together to try to solve, and I'm hopeful in the next few years we're going to be able to do so that democracy, the final thing, actually survives. I'm a big believer that democracy needs an update. We're still on version, in the United States, we're still on version democracy 1.0, and the internet and everything else has moved to version 10,000.0. Democracy needs to be updated to survive as well. So this game has changed. The game of business, the game of dealing with consumers, the game of using technology to advance ourselves as business people and indeed as a culture. I hope I've given you a little flavor for how I think about that and the journey that I've been on, and hopefully a few things you can take back to your own businesses to help not just survive but to thrive in this new digital world. I thank you very much for your time.
One question. Thanks, Stephen. We've got one question from the audience here, time for just one question. What do you believe is the social responsibility of companies like Facebook when their disruption has a negative effect? For example, what happened in Christchurch or the US elections?
Yeah. Am I still on? There we go. Not a surprising question. I think we're entering a new era now where some companies on the face of the earth need to bear responsibility the same type of responsibility we'd assign to governments. So, for example, what happened in Christchurch recently? I actually wrote about it. I wrote an op-ed about it. I spoke in the press about it. And to tell you the truth, it wasn't, I think it's a complex topic, but I basically said, look, I don't think we understand the nature of the problems that have been caused by technology. I think there's a responsibility of the tech giants, because they are just so big, they are so profitable, they need to play a bigger role to help fund the research, help fund the solutions, and they need to be quicker, I believe, to take actions to make sure things don't happen. It's not good enough to say, well, we're going to put technology in people's hands and things are just going to happen. And I know, I was inside Facebook, that was largely the philosophy. It's like, well, hey, the world's full of crazy people, we can't be responsible for every crazy person. I think, you know, if we hold our governments to a different standard than we do companies, I think we need to start to move companies to that standard as well. So we're entering a new era now where we've never seen businesses with this kind of influence on the face of the earth, and so I think we need a different way of thinking about it. Great question.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.